Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Maura Keefe. I'm one of the scholars and residents here. Welcome to PillowTalks. The title of today's talk is Rooted Jazz Dance, taking its title from a new book that we will be talking about, published by University of Florida Press. Susan A. Lee of Northwestern University says that this book artfully weaves history and professional perspectives to reveal the boundaries of the jazz dance world. It invites the reader, that's all of us, to develop a more complicated definition of jazz dance for the 21st century. So I'm going to introduce the co-editors and one of the contributing writers. On the end is Lindsay Guarino, Associate Professor of Dance and Chair of Music Theater and Dance at Salve Regina University. She's also the Artistic Director of Extension's dance company. Next is Wendy Oliver, professor at Providence College, where she teaches dance and women and gender studies. She has written, edited, and co-edited multiple volumes in dance and dance education, receiving awards from the National Dance Association and the National Dance Education Organization for her research and writing. Carlos R.A. Jones is a professor of musical and theater and dance at the State University of New York College at Buffalo, where he is also associate dean and Africana Studies coordinator. His early career as a performer was in concert dance, musical theater, film, and television. And then Melanie George is here today. We might know her best around the Pillow as associate curator. Today she is here as a contributor to this volume. She is a choreographer, educator, and directs the Jazz Is Dance Project. Thanks to all of you for being here, and congratulations on this book. Before we get into the book itself and the essays or chapters within it, I want to talk a little bit about the setup. And I'm going to start with you, Lindsay and Wendy, because this book follows a 2014 book called Jazz Dance, The History of Its Roots and Branches, which you co-edited and you two contributed to. And a brief summary of that book, just to lay this groundwork, says this collection of essays tells the story of jazz dance, past and present, focusing on history and not technique. This anthology examines trends, influences, training, race and gender issues, aesthetics, and the international appeal of jazz dance. So here's my question. Maybe as I'm a dance historian, so maybe this feels like kind of disingenuous or maybe even a softball, but I'm kind of 100% serious about this question. Why is jazz dance history so important to tell? And that you started in 2000, or it was published in 2014, but you started this quest of thinking about the history of jazz dance in that moment. And so let me just start with that. What made you decide this is the history we need to tell?
I think it really started at the copy machine at Providence College, because we were despairing over the fact that there were no books for our classes in jazz dance. And we know of a great book by the Stearnses about jazz dance history, but it stopped in the 1960s. And we said, we really need something that brings us more up to date.
And that just speaks to the complete lack of literature that existed in the field, but in a broader sense, jazz is our American history. And if we're not talking about our American history, if we're holding that piece aside from the larger conversations around dance, about American culture, then we're not seeing who we truly are. And I think that was really important with this book, to just start peeling back those layers.
And one of the things that is clear in that book and in the descriptions of it by critics is that it's really not about technique. And why was that such an important thing to distinguish, that we're talking about history and not technique?
Because there were books that existed post-Stearns in the late 20th century that would show jazz as a series of exercises, and you would see photos of people in very specific positions. And our understanding of jazz was that jazz cannot be shape and line and form. And so we had a real concern, actually, about continuing to perpetuate that notion that jazz can be captured in that sense. And we just felt like we needed to actually talk about the history, talk about the theory behind jazz, and uncover it in its historical, social, political, cultural context.
So Carlos and Melanie, you both contributed at that time. Do you remember the conversation where you got the kind of call, hey, are you interested in writing, or you saw a call for proposals and thought, oh, I want to be part of this conversation because I am part of this conversation?
Well, as I remember it, and correct me if I'm wrong, I feel like several of the authors in the first book, we were in conversation with as a community through National Dance Education Organization conferences. And so Lindsay and I didn't actually know each other, but the jazz community was fairly small, and so it's like 1 degree of separation. We didn't know each other, but we knew someone who knew each other. And so I just got an email in my inbox one day that said, "We're writing this book. Do you want to write something?" And I was like, "Absolutely." And then they waited a very long time for me to turn to my chapter for that first book.
We forgive her.
And Carlos, how about you?
Well, again, at the NDEO conference, and I believe it was Phoenix, somewhere in there, and I just stumbled in to conversations around jazz, and actually remember sitting at the bar with Pat Cohen, who is also a contributor and happens to be here today. And, well, jazz is this, and we began this great conversation, and I kind of carried it off and wandered into this area to look at books, and Wendy's standing there. "We're looking to write this jazz dance book. Are you interested?" And I was like, "Well, sure, give me a call." And she did, and off we ran.
So one of the reasons I wanted to start with that book and not where we are today is because that had momentum, but it also had some resistance. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about subsequent NDEO, is the National Dance Education Organization. Annual conferences happen, and it's primarily high school and university faculty, some studio owners as well. But people had very particular responses to the first book. So maybe you could talk, because they talk quite directly about this in the preface of the book.
I think that it emerged more so when we were hosting a series of special topics conferences, which in 2019, Melanie and Carlos co-facilitated one, so they can probably speak even more directly about that experience. But the reason why we had this idea for a follow-up book is because I just felt like people were really comfortable saying the roots of jazz are West African, but not actually talking about the Black American experience and how that was the piece that leads us to understand what jazz is. And it just opened up broader conversations about race and identity, and people, that's not a comfortable place for people to be if they're not having those conversations already. I don't think we're socialized as Americans to have conversations around race. And so our experience at those conferences was met with some outright resistance, and also just, I don't know, maybe you can elaborate.
Yeah, I think if we're trying to tie it to Roots and Branches, people love that book. And they were very comfortable with the way that book, which is where we were at that time.
Right, so that published nearly 10 years ago now.
Yeah,
yep,
right.
So written in the...
So I think I found an email recently that was like from 2013 when I was turning it in, or maybe a Facebook post, but they were very comfortable with that book because the approach to that book was very sort of egalitarian in terms of like, let's get chapters on these artists that we've sort of universally decided are important 20th century figures in jazz, and let's give sort of equal weight to everyone. And that allowed some folks to sort of stay at that exact same place and not move forward. But we moved forward from that book.
So you're saying, Melanie, that people were comfortable with the artists themselves, and we recognize them as icons, and as long as we're celebrating the individual artists, we don't have to think much more deeply about the form itself. Is that what you...
And I, not Melanie, but a hypothetical reader of book, don't have to change anything that I'm actually teaching in the classroom.
One thing that kept bubbling up is just people saying, but if I'm only going to teach vernacular movement in the studio, I'm not training my dancers for careers in the field. And then, we just watched Swing Out. Debunked.
So I think, Lindsay, you're saying something, and then I'm going to get to you, Carlos. You're saying something about that people were wanting to separate technique from history. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, so here's the thing. I think the place that we all land, and Pat, is that there's a technique to everything. But when people were saying technique, what they meant was ballet. which then allows you to say, well, Luigi's in the book and Giordano's in the book, and who's like those particularly those white men of the 20th century. It allows you to not have to actually interrogate your own practice. And I feel like the book, that first book, which I feel I love that book. I actually wrote about music video dance in that book because that was a real passion of mine. But that book was a way for us as teachers to not have to be using all those dance magazine articles anymore when we were teaching. But we're not there,
So let me, Carlos, say what you were going to say, but I'm going to pile on another question to it. Is so that it sounds like you're saying that book laid the foundation to have the deeper conversations. Right, yes. And so maybe, Carlos, you have something to add about some of the special topics and maybe the surprising or maybe not surprising resistance.
Yeah, I think what I would add on top of that, absolutely everything that these brilliant artists have been saying, is there was also the conversation of, yeah, but how do I get there? I'm ready for this journey. We, the teacher, the person. There was pushback, but there were people saying, I see it, but I just don't know how to get there because I'm so steeped and mired in what I've been doing and what I've been teaching. How do I begin to investigate, as Melanie said, and question my own practice? And so I remember distinctly having that conversation with Melanie and Wendy when they asked me to join on as editor to go, okay, if we're going into this, then we're going to have a real conversation. And we're going to really talk about some subject about how you look at jazz dance's movement that is rooted in the practice where it starts. And what does that mean? And why is that not considered a technique? So we had to unpack that, unearth that, and then allow people to a point of access to begin to investigate their own practice.
So Wendy, maybe you want to jump in here because you have done the wonderful labor, and the field is really grateful for the work of editing collections that gets multiple voices out there. The labor of getting the book out in 2014. How did you know we've got to continue the conversation that the field needed the next book?
Well, one thing I wanted to mention was that we had a big group conversation in the first book on email of all the authors. We had an email chain, and one chapter that Lindsay and I did together was defining all the different kinds of jazz dance. And the whole idea that there are different kinds of jazz dance was a topic of conversation, but there was definitely some people who felt that jazz is jazz, and then everything else is something different. And then some people felt that jazz is what was going on in with Bob Fosse, et cetera, and that what came before that needed a modifier. So people had all these different ideas of what it was, and I think that was so revealing. To have these conversations, not to come to total agreement, but at least to have an idea of all the different opinions, and then to have the image of the tree, which was in both books, to help us conquer.
Yep, we'll get to the tree in just a second.
Yeah.
So you were ready you could tell that the conversation needed to continue.
Right.
So I deliberately did not read the subtitle of the book until now, which is Africanist Aesthetics and Equity in the 21st Century. So one thing you said is that you're looking at great stuff that's been written, but it stops in the 1960s. You write a book in 2014 that brings the conversation at least through the 20th century, but now you're squarely saying we're in the 21st century. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the kind of historical moment that would not be ignored in putting this book together.
Where do I begin with that? I mean, we were editing this book in the midst of COVID. We weren't prepared for that to happen. We weren't prepared for the murder of George Floyd and the social and political upheaval that followed. And I think that going into the book, we were well aware that we were going to be grappling with race and identity, and that was the whole reason why I approached Wendy and I said, I think it's time for this next book. And she said yes. And we went to Carlos because his research in the first book was on race in jazz and also acknowledging that we as two white women shouldn't be editing a book on a Black American art form without Carlos's voice being centered. And we knew what we were walking into, but then our world was flipped upside down, right? And it was in those moments that I think then we just realized, oh, we are really going to do this. And we're going to do it in the most honest way that we possibly can. And that meant a deep interrogation of our own personal identities, but also in community. And I'm speaking as the three of us as editors, but I don't want to also ignore that Melanie was my go-to person through this whole process too. And when I speak of community, there were conversations happening in multiple circles that were coming together, and it was really heightened because of COVID. All of a sudden we could Zoom, we could have those conversations because there was a desire to connect, an absence of what we were, usually engaged with. And I think that in those moments, we just saw the power of what it was to speak truth where truth hadn't been spoken.
I mean, one of the things that is striking about this book is you have a preface, you have an editor's note, and you have an introduction. And I was really struck by the editor's note in particular because the three of you, briefly, really foreground your own perspectives. You talk about being white women, Carlos talks about being a man of color, and that you don't... you don't do that thing that academia often does, which just sort of puts the thing out there and assumes there's no body or person behind it. And I'm wondering if it was the moment in time that made you know that you had to say that.
100%. Carlos can speak to it.
I think so, 100%, because we kept having conversations around things that would go on or would happen or information that would come in, and the response would have a perspective. And then I would immediately turn around and go, but this is how I see it. Mm-hmm. And it was totally shift the conversation and move in another direction. I said, we cannot do this book without being rooted within who we are. Plus, I think that that's the jazz experience. Mm-hmm. I think that is really what it is. Who are you? Your identity is so much as a part of the community. Mm-hmm. Who is Melanie? Who am I? And so we had to go from that point.
So let me ask you this, because you've set me up to ask my next question beautifully. Thank you. And I don't think we need an exhaustive answer, but maybe a collaborative one. How do you know what jazz dance is when you see it?
Who just went to swing up?
The first book did a good job of that.
Oh, sorry. Will you take the microphone back and say that again?
Sorry. The first book did a very good job of describing how you know when it's jazz, mm-hmm. and it can be a series of characteristics, some of which come from the African experience. Some of them are more African American, but a lot of very specific things.
So build on that. Go ahead.
I'm going to point over here to Pat Cohen, who really beautifully lays out a list of characteristics. And in this text, I took it beyond that list, and I also included some additional ideas like the relationship with jazz music, mm-hmm. ideas like aesthetic of the cool, ephebism, things that you can't necessarily see and point to, but you feel them. You feel groove. You feel when you start to tap your leg or clap your hands. Like there's something in jazz that it's very visceral. So when you're hearing jazz music, you know it, mm-hmm. and I feel like jazz dance speaks to that same experience.
However, I think one of my concerns is that a lot of contemporary teaching assumes that if you were dancing to jazz or you were
Dancing
dancing
to
to
jazz
popular
music,
music, that you are automatically doing jazz. And that is not true. So I think it does come back to rhythm and weight and swinging and polyrhythmicism and the way weight shifts and all of those things that like we're putting language to them, but in some ways I don't want to say they're intangible because I feel like they're very much felt, but that it's the doing of the thing that's important as opposed to the naming of the thing. So to be completely honest with you, Maura, I'm disinterested in that question at this point. Because I feel like that question is a place that people who didn't move beyond roots and branches are stuck in.
So I'm happy to have you be disinterested in my question, but now I'm going to keep asking it. Because, I mean, there is this way in which we have to make room for it. And so that people, I think maybe more people that are not participating in it typically name it. Or, scholars or historians look at something and then we say, we've noticed this set of characteristics or whatever, and can we encapsulate it? But because and we're going to get to your chapter where you lay it all out in this book and you do this work that you're resisting. so I guess I'm saying, like, to make room for the conversation, and you use the terms jazz-related or jazzy get used in the book. So for somebody, maybe you say why people get stuck in what's in and what's out.
I mean, I can't speak for why those people get stuck because I'm not stuck, but I guess part of why I'm saying I'm disinterested in that question is because as much as I'm a writer and a scholar about jazz and I think about jazz all the time, the talking about it or the writing about it without embodying it is really not helpful. And so I think it's really going back to Lindsay's earlier point about like people who are like, oh, I recognize that jazz has West African roots and now my work is done. Like, that I think there's some of that there where like it's really easy to be reading about it, but like go to a Lindy event and like dance with some people who know how to do Lindy, and then I don't actually have to explain to you with language what jazz is because you've actually felt it in your body.
You can't just check boxes. Ultimately, if you're just checking boxes, you're not making jazz because you're not in that moment of just bringing out whatever is so deeply personal to you in conversation with the music in that specific moment in time. So when we get too academic about the way that we might be doing X, Y, Z, we're not actually open to the jazz experience. We're taking ourselves up here in a very Cartesian sense of like, this is how we prioritize mind over body rather than an Africanist sense which prioritizes the embodiment over the thinking.
Carlos, you want to add into this collective?
Well, I was going to really sort of go out for a little bit because I think jazz is everywhere. Because it's so much intertwined into the fabric of who we are as America. We've forgotten how to understand it. And that has been systematic because of a system that deems to have hierarchy in terms of movement and ideas and aesthetics and what we sell and what we make as a commodity. So we have untrained ourselves to understand what it is. And so now we ask, well, what is it? But I think it's there. And once you retool or go back and reinvestigate, you begin to see. Well, for me, I see rhythms everywhere. I see, the conversation, polycentrism. I see it in everything, even that which we think maybe isn't present.
So I'm actually hearing you two say sort of the same thing, that Melanie is saying, stop asking that question because it's limiting, and you're saying, teach us to open our eyes and see it broadly, and to stop trying to get it too codified that we can name it in a very particular way, which then leads me, as Wendy started to say, there's this wonderful illustration that's in the front of the book, and sorry you can't see it in the PowerPoint version of this, you will see it projected behind us, but instead we have trees instead of this tree that is here. Wendy, describe this tree and talk about why you decided to move it from the 2014 book into this book.
Well, that was also the basis for a big discussion amongst all the authors in the first book. And what we did, I believe I made the first sketches that were terrible because I'm not an artist, but we just put it out there that we had this idea. I found an artist to do it, and then we put it out there and ask for feedback. And people had all kinds of ideas about how to improve it, which was great, very helpful. And that improved version has been used by a lot of teachers to explain how it all connects.
Melanie, you're looking at it. Describe it for people who aren't looking at it.
Sure. It is a tree in which the text African and African dance are the roots. And then through the center of the trunk, you see the text vernacular, jazz dance and vernacular continuing to go up. And then you have all these sort of crisscrossing branches that are naming the many, many styles that come out of that. But going back to the idea that without the Middle Passage bringing enslaved black people to America, there is no root of jazz dance, and that vernacular is the Black American experience and movement coming through the center.
So in the introduction, you really, the three of you, write about the term rooted as really being kind of the most important thing. And maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, I think the idea that being rooted takes the jazz back to those roots that Melanie just spoke about. And that rooted experience is what has been erased or eliminated throughout history in favor of other styles, which were created as people imposed other techniques, ideas, concepts on top of it. It was washed away. And that rooted experience is where the African American experience lives. And so those voices, those people that invented and created at its inception, many of the names we heard Melanie speak earlier today in our conversation were lost and not moved forward. And it became a conversation of, is that rooted experience, or the roots of it, is it archaic? Is it something that died away? And so it was very important for us to acknowledge those and go back and give it its place where it is, because it is very much a part of who we are as America.
So putting on your editing hat or editorial hat for a moment, can you talk about what kind of voices you wanted to make sure were writing in the book and the variety of writers that you reached out to?
Go ahead. I'm just going to say, we wanted to include artists and have their experience as performers and choreographers be a part of it. So that was one very important thing.
We did start by reaching out to everyone who had contributed to Roots and Branches and asking if anyone was interested in submitting an abstract to our call. So we started with those authors. And the editing process ends up just being a big web of filling in gaps and trying to figure out, just uncovering what the book needs to be. And so we started to get some abstracts and then identify the gaps for what else needed to be written and identify the people that, I remember Melanie saying, I'm going to ask Latasha, because Latasha would be great to write this chapter on
Latasha Barnes, that some of you just saw perform in Swing Out.
So similar to what Melanie had said about the first book, it was, again, a process of, I know this person who's perfect to write this chapter. And also just being really honest about what the book needed to be and finding the people who could speak truth to where we saw the book heading.
Yeah, and creating a space for voices that had not been heard. Latasha was one of them. But it was very important for that, and to looking at even the content of who we were talking about. We didn't want to center those white male voices anymore that you typically have centered in jazz books because other stories needed to be told.
So, Wendy, maybe you could say a little bit more about why and I don't mean why the artist voices are important, because of course we know why the voices are important for this conversation, but why that would be perhaps novel to an academic audience to hear those voices.
Well, typically with an academic book and the kind of book we had in mind, although it's not a straight history book, it incorporates history and research. You would not include artist statements as part of that. But we felt it was important to have a broader swath of experience and also of ideas within the book. And that's also why we have a whole section on pedagogy, which is also unusual in an academic textbook, because we felt that this book really wouldn't be doing its job if it weren't helping people to teach jazz in a new way.
Melanie, can I ask you to say something about you had the challenge, I would call it a challenge, of laying out the recent history. And, we think of jazz history, maybe we think, oh, this happened in the 30s, and I'm talking about something that was in the 50s. And no, you really are setting out the environment for the 21st century. Could you talk a little bit about maybe the stress of that, like that, like how do you be inclusive? How do you that this is something that's happening right now, that you're trying to account for it in that way?
This was not the stressful chapter. The other one I wrote is the stressful chapter. This one was actually really simple to write because I'm in the fortunate position of being in. So I call myself a recovering academic. I used to teach in a university for a very long time, and I don't anymore. But I'm in the very fortunate position to be in dialogue, understanding what the academic environment is, and then I also work in this other world, right, where I'm actively working with dancers. I'm a working dance dramaturg, and so I'm sort of like hub to a spoke of many different areas in which jazz presents itself, right? I'm also a working choreographer and educator. So it really was just like, I just happen to know a lot of things and know a lot of people. And so like the section in that chapter where it's like, here's where Lindy Hop is happening. I know Caleb, I know Latasha, we talk all the time. So I knew exactly how to find that information and how to, and the hardest thing in that chapter to write was actually not even in the chapter initially until I sent it to the editors, and they were like, well, you need to include something on contemporary jazz. And I was like, do I have to? And they said, yes, you do. So, and that was actually harder because that's just not an area that I'm just not associated with by choice. And so, yeah, it was just really a matter of sort of laying out, oh, here's the other thing. I have a website called Jazz Dance Direct, which is a directory website for jazz, in which you can find a searchable directory in which you can find college programs in the U.S. that are jazz dance, or jazz dance is centered, no, maybe not centered, but a part of the curriculum, organizations that are jazz dance focused, events that are jazz dance based, publications, which really means books on the website, and I feel like there's a fifth category companies that still claim jazz as their descriptor, and it's meant to be truly a searchable directory and not like a list of Melanie's faves. So there's stuff on there that I'm just like not interested in at all. But the point was, I wanted, when students were constantly asking me where can I find out more about jazz, I had nowhere to send them, and so I made a website where they could find things. And so that's how I knew that the majority of jazz dance events that are happening around the world are actually Lindy events, because I'd already done that research for the website.
You can find this a link on Melanie's website, melaniegeorge.org, or through Jazz Dance Is. Sorry.
I own all the jazz websites.
Yeah, okay,
I own all the
good.
domains.
Okay,
but, so you can go to melaniegeorge.org. There's a romance writer and a pop star who have .com, so I can't have that one. And or jazzdancedirect.com. Yeah.
Okay. So now I want to ask you, thank you for being the transition into talking about the writing of this, is that editing is a very different thing from writing. And I wonder if you could talk about a little bit how you knew what your perspective was going to be as a writer. You have your idea of how the book needs to be laid out, what's missing, but then it's time now for you to shift into writing. So Carlos, maybe I want to ask you to say something about performer, academic, dean, editor, those things, and how those different kinds of paths came into your writing voice.
Okay, well that's, so within the book, I think I actually separate some of those thoughts out. There's a choreographic perspectives chapter, which I really talk about my work as an artist and how I see and create jazz in space. And full disclosure, disclaimer, my jazz has gone the gamut. That tree, I've been all over it. Primarily because not only do I work in concert dance, but I work in musical theater. And I worked in television, in commercials and film, and we know that choreography is that long. So I've had to, it's run the gamut. So that was my voice looking at it as an artist, to really, I had to kind of put on the hat and go, how do I actually create? And what am I looking for when I create actual jazz work? And I did that through that lens. As an educator, I was really interested in having the conversation about technique, because I think that that term, particularly in my own experience, was very, very narrow, the definition of that. Again, my eclectic background, and I really actually went out and thought about it in terms of music. I started out as a musician. And so my understanding about technique was very different. When I played the viola, I had a technique versus when I played the French horn. Two very different techniques. And so when I was working in dance and they kept saying, this is only technique, I'm like, well, no, I use something different when I'm working in jazz than I do. And so I really wanted to, as an educator, break that apart. And so a lot of time, what I did in that chapter was really look at what is the idea of technique versus an aesthetic that you want, right? And how do you use a specific technique to get that aesthetic versus that, right? So that's how to do it. And then I think in the final closeout chapter was really where I was using that sort of administrative dean hat. How do we move forward social justice-wise? How do we pull things together? How do we have these conversations in spaces where people are at different points and not ready to have it? And the only way I thought it was important was to talk about myself. I find that is the easiest way into social justice work, is where is my truth and where do I sit in it?
So Lindsay, you write about that. You talk about a kind of deliberate shift from thinking about your own training as a mover to educating yourself as a viewer. Could you talk about that perspective?
So I was trained in a way that now when I look back at my previous training or even the way that I taught jazz 10 years ago, that's exactly the thing I'm trying to interrupt now. I definitely prioritized a ballet base in my training. I had great jazz training, so this is not a knock on any of my jazz educators. They're still close mentors today. They're people I value deeply. I think that we're all a product of the world around us. And so my education at that point in jazz was very much upholding white narratives. And at some point around editing Roots and Branches, I just felt that it was my job to start changing that whole entire practice. And that started by just looking at jazz everywhere. And using that list that Pat Cohen so beautifully crafted in her chapter, and also the thing that was there in my jazz training when I started to strip away the ballet, which I felt like, oh, this is where the jazz is. It's not about how high my leg can go or how many turns I can do. It's actually about the rhythm and the groove. And when I leaned into that place, I feel like that's where things got really exciting for me. And that's where I started to rethink my whole entire jazz class, the way I educate my students. And so it just became a whole process of dismantling everything I believed and everything I thought I knew. And finding that like elusive part of jazz and the unknown. Because for me, this is something we've kind of joked about, but it's not really a joke. I have to work that much harder because I'm a white person. Like, there isn't this innate knowledge of the Black American experience in me. Even though we are all immersed in the way that Black American culture affects every part of our American culture. And so I think that there's this process of like these steps that we have to take to interrogate our own positionality and interrogate who we are to find the jazz. Melanie and Carlos have said often, well, it's a little bit, they're closer to it. They're always going to be there, where for me, I feel like it takes that much more work, maybe. I don't know. I don't want to speak for either of you, but conversations that we've had that felt really important to me were just about like how we enter the work because of who we are, because of what our experiences have been, and then going forward, what we choose to uphold and what we choose to dismantle.
So, Wendy, you did a very different kind of perspective. You really looked at the world and found data and evidence to indicate just the sort of the status of jazz dance in recent history. Maybe you could talk a little bit about where it's been presented, what percentage of works might be called jazz dance, what's been getting awards, that kind of thing.
Right. Well, one of the things I did was to look at all the big awards like Capizio, the MacArthur Genius Grant, and some of the other ones like that on the East Coast, particularly because that's where not because I was interested particularly in the East Coast, but that's where all those organizations and foundations are located. And what I discovered, unfortunately, was that a lot of awards are given to ballet organizations and individuals, modern and contemporary organizations and individuals, and very few jazz companies and artists. So I believe the percentages were something like 31% each for ballet and modern, and then about between 5 and 10% for jazz artists. And that was very broadly, that was including Broadway and everything. So every kind of jazz you can think of. And then the rest went to producing organizations and tap dancers and other genres. So it's a very small percentage of dancers who are in the jazz genre who get recognized for what they're doing. And I think it's amazing that, it just seems like with this performance that we just saw and some Pat Taylor we saw on Wednesday, that maybe a little more light is coming to jazz dance.
So you made a deliberate choice, not so much based on your own experience, but to provide evidence and for people who need that kind of cold, hard,
exactly.
Quantitative data to say, right.
I looked at company budgets as well. That was a little discouraging. but the top 10 ballet companies, each one of them has millions of dollars to work with, whereas the jazz companies have much smaller budgets. Of course, fewer dancers as well, but there just isn't the corporate support and the general governmental support for the smaller jazz organizations.
And Melanie, I feel like your chapter in the two-word summary for me is sort of like a choreographic analysis, that you're bringing your strengths as a dramaturg and an embodied, experienced mover into thinking about jazz. Could you say something about that perspective?
Sure. The chapter comes out of I have two chapters in the book, and this is the second one. It comes out of conversations that I was having with Lindsay and Carlos and a bunch of other folks on a shared WhatsApp chat, and really asking questions. It's actually related to the website, like where are all the jazz companies and where are all the jazz choreographers? So why is it part of part of what Wendy's saying is also that there's a dearth of people making jazz, right? And that has to do with capitalism and commercialization, and but also if we think about that there's a couple of different tracks about how someone goes into a professional career as a choreographer. One of those is going through an academic experience, and then you go out into the world. You get your degree from your conservatory or your, 4-year institution, and then you go into the world. And in those institutions, that's where the most formalized choreography classes are happening. And those students are almost universally being taught from a postmodern lens. And I know this because not only was I a student of that, I taught that way for a long time because I taught the way I was taught. And so part of the reason that we don't have as many jazz choreographers is because we're not actually training them how to actually make jazz dances, right? We're training them how to make modern dances, but no one wants to really talk about that, right? That composition classes in higher ed are actually modern dance classes. And so starting from that, I began to question, like, how do we had this conversation so much. Like, I want to write about, like, what is jazz choreography? And so, yeah, I just sort of tried to identify, like, what are the elements that make jazz choreography? Like, there's a line somewhere in that chapter where I say something like, if you have this element and this element, it's jazz. But if you take rhythm out of that, you have contemporary, but it's not contemporary jazz. And so like rhythm is fundamental is the point I'm trying to make. And so much of what I'm seeing in terms of what's being called contemporary jazz is arrhythmic and amusical. And music and rhythm are fundamental to jazz dancing and jazz making. You saw it. If you saw a swing out, you just saw it right there. There's a reason why they have a live band, right? And so, just trying to find a way into languaging that, but while also being wary of trying to not over-academicize it.
And to not limit it, like to the same question of your sort of disinterest in what is the jazz dance question, to not say, here's the formula to then be a jazz choreographer, right? Yeah. I'm going to ask you, Carlos, before I open it up for questions from everybody else, if you would just read a little bit from your chapter.
Sure. Can I get someone to hold the microphone?
I can hold it for you.
Okay, because I'm going to have to.
I warned him. Don't
Yes.
worry.
Okay. This is just a passage. My body, our black and brown bodies, are very much the jazz experience in America. Resembling jazz dance, the African roots are embedded in our DNA. Our bodies are the trunks standing in the amalgamated globe of the American experience and often disassociated from our own heritage. Countless times, unknowingly, and often unwillingly. Many of us have traversed colonized movement systems, navigated Eurocentric training methodologies, and participated in aesthetic reprogramming only to be abandoned among the branches in the poorly fitted techniques. We have been stranded there, forever altered and untethered to our jazz heritage. You know, the rooted one.
I feel like in that passage we get a sense of how this book operates. So thank you for doing that for us. We have time for some of your questions or comments, and I'm going to repeat them so everybody can hear. So this is a question about the film called Uprooted and the organization called Intangible Roots and the connection that you all might have with those things.
So I'm going to pass this to these three because they were in the film.
No, would be the simple answer.
Oh, can I just say, so the Uprooted
I was just
is,
going to add.
Okay, you're going to
But Mansell, Intangible Roots, Mansell has a chapter in this text, and he was also very much a part of our conversation. So, but No, the film is very separate from this text.
So there's a new documentary that I think you can see on HBO and at film festivals that you have all consulted on, and it's called Uprooted. And Monsell Durden, who has been a director of the program in the school here at Jacob's Pillow, has a chapter in this book and is part of that, just for some more flesh to that. But evidently roots are important, is what we're learning. Another question or comment? This is great. First, she thanks you for your work and is already commenting on how it's making her think about what she's seeing differently. And she's referring to what she saw this afternoon in Swing Out, and that whereas ballet might value a kind of uniformity of line and energy and spatial arrangement, that this afternoon she felt like she really saw the dancers as individuals, especially in relationship to the musicians one-on-one. And maybe, Melanie, you could say something about this since you've worked with this company.
Sure. What I would say is what you saw, the thing you're naming, is actually jazz. And that sense of trying to take out the individuality and the improvisation and the democracy and the agency is actually anti-jazz. And so that is part of why I think we collectively feel so strongly about reinforcing, writing about, and publishing the rooted perspective, because what's happened in the narrative over the 20th century is that that other version has been promoted as that being jazz, right, at the expense of what is actually where the form starts, right? Black American perspective is going to be designed for everyone to have a voice. But if you focus on uniformity, everyone doesn't get a voice anymore.
And can I also add something that I don't think we've really touched upon? Jazz was born as a social art form. And when jazz moved into the studios and on Broadway stages and became highly choreographed, all of the social values were lost. So there's nothing social about everyone does the same thing and directs their energy outward at the audience, right? So again, those things that when you see it, you know it. We're seeing the way that the dancers are connecting, and that's inspiring authenticity and community and jazz.
And by the way, that's how the musicians do it, right?
Yeah.
So if we're thinking about why is jazz called jazz, right? It's because the dance and the music were actually happening at the same time, developing at the same time.
And I just add that you talk about the uniformity of it, but there are agreements. There's the community agreement that was happening on that stage, and so they were there. They were there at the same time, and there was a uniformity because they agreed to be there at the same time, riding that rhythm. So.
And last question. So first to point out that this contributes to the need for additional resources, so that there is not enough written about jazz dance, and to thank you for that. And then as a Lindy Hopper herself and somebody who teaches it, she values the sense of community, but is raising the question that I think maybe I'm going to ask you to start, Lindsay, by answering her question about that. It's not her dance from her roots. How to move into a place of comfort with of participating.
You said something so important that I'm not even sure you knew you were saying, but when you're speaking of community and how we can operate from community, I think that debunks our American notion of individualism. And when we lean into individualism, we are promoting systems of codification. We're promoting capitalism. We're promoting these ways that we've thought about dance historically that have upheld white values. And so I think that part of the answer, at least part of it, is just leaning into who are you having conversations with, who are you listening to, who is in your whole ecosystem of people around you, and how can you make sure that you are hearing those voices that aren't your white voice? How can you make sure that you're engaged with practices that aren't just what you've learned from your teachers? So I think it's a really big task to start to ask those questions, But I also just think it's really exciting when we start to look into what maybe wasn't our own individual experience, but what we can learn and how we can continue to learn and grow.
Melanie, you want to add to that?
Yeah, the thing that drew us to working together on this book and the previous book wasn't we want to write a book. It was that we were so glad to find community because we had been siloed in our individual institutions. And I think the swing out model of, they came to Caleb first and said, do you want to make a thing? And Caleb said, I'm going to only do it if I can do it with my friends. Right? So it doesn't say Caleb Teicher swing out. Right? That's purposeful. And to me, the only way forward with trying to either affirm and uphold your value system or excavate and uncover a new one in terms of this work in jazz is through community. It's the only way forward. Shared responsibility and community organizing. And again, that's so antithetical to how we framed all of dance history, right? It's about this person and their one idea and their company name, but I don't know, how's that working for us? Like look where we are right now,
So you all can be part of this community specifically by picking up a flyer on the music stand there, which will give you, here we got a model right here in the front row, thank you, which will give you a way to order the book from the Academic Press website. And there's a discount code, thanks to our folks here for including us in this really exciting conversation. And thank you all for being here.
Thank you.